Today we're going to talk about a tool called scope of consciousness. You know, we all have a certain scope of consciousness. In fact, we have, in the middle of our scope of consciousness, something called an unconscious perception. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And then we have a scope of consciousness, all the things that we are conscious about. And around that, we have a zone of oblivion. Let me describe these three circles. The unconscious perception is all the things excuse me, that we perceive quite unconsciously. Have you ever driven to work in the morning, got up, got dressed, got in your car, and drove to work? You got all the way into the building, into your office, and you can't remember a moment of the entire ride to work. You know, we all have those situations. And you ask yourself, was I blacked out? Was I in a coma? No, you were unconsciously perceiving everything that was going on. To the extent anything unusual happened, you would have noted the perception, noted it consciously. But since everything was pretty routine, nothing was retained in your memory. That's the unconscious perception. And then around that is the scope of consciousness. Everything you are conscious about. You can see it, you can smell it, you can hear it, you can touch it, you feel it. It is the area around us in our world of which we are conscious. But we all have, beyond that, a zone of oblivion. Things that we don't see, things that we don't feel, we don't hear. Even though other people hear it, other people see it, we don't. And each of us has a different zone of oblivion. So each of us has certain things that we don't see. You know, let me share with you some of my items in my zone of oblivion. By the way, my wife tells me I have a large zone of oblivion. But here's one that I don't see. I walk into a room. There might be artwork around the room. I would never notice it. I could never tell you what the artwork was. The carpet, I couldn't tell you what the color of the carpet was. The other day, one of my co-workers asked me, Balaji, what is the color of the airport, the carpet at the Portland airport? Now, I live in Portland. And by the way, I travel to the airport every week. Every week I get on an airplane. I've lived in Portland for 30 years. I still didn't know what the color of the carpet at the Portland airport was. I could not describe the design. Now, is that because I don't see it? No, it's in my zone of oblivion. You see, I don't notice those things. That just happens, that's me. Now, my wife, who's an artist, by the way, when she could walk into this room, she could spend hardly 3 to 5 minutes looking at this room. She could walk out and she could paint this entire room almost like it was. Now, what's the difference? You see, her zone of oblivion is very different. She sees everything, and it's in her scope of consciousness. What is in my zone of oblivion? So, in general, your zone of oblivion is unique to you. Others, they see it, so it is in their scope of consciousness. Understanding what your zone of oblivion is very useful. You see, when you have an idea, great idea, you think this is wonderful. You try to explain it to somebody. They understand the idea, but they don't see your fascination. They don't see why you're so excited. You know why that happens? Oftentimes, it's because you have something in your scope of consciousness that is in their zone of oblivion. So whereas you see this, the opportunity in the marketplace, you are excited, they don't see it. So think about, why would they not see it? What might be in your scope of consciousness that is in their zone of oblivion? And by the way, it could happen the other way too. Somebody's trying to explain an idea to you, and you don't get it. You're not excited. You're not fascinated by it. You might have something in your zone of oblivion that actually is in their scope of consciousness. So this ability to connect with people and understand the excitement one has over the other often is because of mismatch in scope of consciousness. what is important is not that you somehow eliminate your zone of oblivion. You can't. You can't. But it is useful to understand what is in your zone of oblivion. Be able to acknowledge it, understand it, and be aware of it. But isn't that a catch-22 situation? If you don't see it, how do you know you didn't see it? How can you tell all the things that you don't actually see? Well, that becomes a catch-22 question. Well, it isn't quite as bad. You see, what happens is this. During the course of your general day-to-day activities, try to be observant of times when you didn't see something, others did. You didn't hear something, others did. You didn't feel something, others did. No, observe that. Notice when that happens. And then try to make a mental or even a written tabulation of when those things happen. Try to find patterns in them. For example, for me, the patterns are, I don't see visual cues. I don't see visual things. By the way, if there were some numbers written on the walls, I could walk out of here, I could give you everything about the number, including all its properties. So each of us has a different zone of oblivion. Understand what the pattern, is there a pattern to the kind of things I miss out on? And then once you can find that pattern, you say, you know what, that's what is in my zone of oblivion. So what can you do with that if it's in the zone of oblivion? Well, you can become more cognizant of it. You can surround yourself with people for whom that is not in the zone of oblivion. You can become more open to ideas that seem to encroach on what is in your zone of oblivion. You can do something more intentional about it. I'm not asking you to eliminate your zone of oblivion. That's not possible. I'm asking you to become conscious and intentional about your zone of oblivion. So be very conscious of what is your scope of consciousness and your zone of oblivion.